Welcome to the English Grammar Assistant channel.
Lesson 2. Sentence Structure 2.
The building block of the English sentence is called clause. There are two clause types.
The main clause, also called the independent clause. The subordinate clause, also called the dependent clause.
The main clause consists primarily of subject and verb as main parts, and it can be formed according to one of the 17 different configurations we described in the previous video. It must also express a complete idea. The subordinate clause, like the main clause, mainly consists of subject and verb, and can be formed according to one of the configurations we described in the last video. However, it doesn't express a complete idea, and can't stand alone as a complete sentence. Therefore, it must be connected to a main clause in the sentence.
For example, he didn't score high in the exam, although he studied hard.
He didn't score high in the exam is a main clause. It has a subject, he, and a verb, soccer. It gives a complete meaning and can stand alone if we get rid of the rest of the sentence. He studied hard is a subordinate clause. It has a subject, he, and a verb, studied. It doesn't give a complete meaning and can't stand alone if we eliminate the main clause. It must also be preceded with a connector in order to connect it to the main clause, which is although here.
So, how the English sentence is structured.
Every English sentence must contain at least one main clause. In one type, it can just be structured of only one main clause, and in this case it's called simple sentence.
For example, he plays tennis. This sentence is a simple sentence because it consists of only one main clause that has a subject, verb, and an object.
In a second type, it can be structured of two or more main clauses connected to each other with connectors called coordinate conjunctions. Of these connectors, and, or, but, so, nor, and yet.
Sentence of this form is called compound sentence.
For example, I write the reports and Anna types them. In this example we have two main clauses connected with the and conjunction, and each clause has a subject and verb. The first clause is I write the reports. The second clause is Anna types them.
In a third type, it can be structured of a main clause connected to a subordinate clause with connector, such as when, who, because, and that.
Sentence of this form is called complex sentence.
For example, I bumped into a car while I was driving. In this sentence we have a subordinate clause, also called dependent clause, connected to a main clause, also called independent clause, with a while connector. The subordinate clause is I was driving. The main clause is I bumped head into a car.
The subordinate clauses have three types: the adjective clause, the adverb clause, and the noun clause. The adjective clause is also called relative clause. it comes after a noun to describe it. The information that it gives about the noun that it follows are either essential, and in this case the clause is called defining relative clause, or additional, and in this case the clause is called non-defining relative clause.
For example, the person who is sitting next to my sister is my cousin. The clause who is sitting next to my sister is the adjective clause in this sentence, and it's connected to the main clause with the connector, who. The adjective clause here is relative defining clause, because it defines and determines which person a speaker means. If we eliminate the adjective clause, for example, and keep the main clause, the sentence will be like this. The person is my cousin. This sentence has complete idea. However, which person a speaker means is unclear. Therefore the adjective clause in this case is necessary for defining, specifying the noun, and making it clear for the listener. Note in this case that the subject of the adjective clause is the connector, who itself, and is called relative pronoun. The connectors of the adjective clauses, beside their function as connectors, they also function as either subjects or objects of the adjective clauses. Another example. My only brother, who has lived in London for 10 years, is coming back home next week. The clause, who has lived in London for 10 years, is the adjective clause in this sentence, and it's connected to the main clause with the connector, who. The adjective clause here is relative non-defining clause, because the speaker's brother is defined person to the listener, and the adjective clause just gives extra information about it. If we eliminate the adjective clause, for example, and keep the main clause, the sentence will be like this. My only brother is coming back home next week. This sentence has complete idea, and the noun, brother, that the adjective clause is describing is well known to the listener, and clearly defined. Therefore the function of the adjective clause here is just to describe the defined noun more. Note. Also in this case the subject of the adjective clause is the connector, who, itself.
Connectors of adjective clauses. The relative pronouns who and whom. These two connectors follow persons' nouns. However, who can function as either the subject or object of the adjective clause, whereas whom can only function as the object of the adjective clause. The relative pronoun which. This connector follows object nouns. It usually functions as the object of the adjective clause. However, it can function as the subject of the adjective clause when the adjective clause is in the passive voice. The relative pronoun that. This connector can be used in place of who or which. However, it has advantage over which when used with object nouns. The relative pronoun whose. This connector is used with possession to mean of who or of which. When and where are adjective clauses connectors, but they doesn't belong to the relative clauses connectors family. When is used with adjective clauses that describe time, and where is used with adjective clauses that describe place or position. English speakers tend to shorten the adjective clauses either by removing the relative pronoun, the connector, or by reducing the clause's words. The factor that determines which way of shortening to be used is whether the relative pronoun is the object or subject of the adjective clause. When the connector is the object of the adjective clause, then removing the connector is the way of shortening. When the connector is the subject of the adjective clause, then reducing the adjective clause is the way of shortening. So, how the adjective clauses are reduced? There are two ways to reduce adjective clauses.
When the adjective clause is in the active mode, we eliminate the connector, which is also the subject of the clause, eliminate helping verbs, and change the verb form to the base form plus ing.
When the adjective clause is in the passive mode, we eliminate the connector, which is also the subject of the clause, eliminate helping verbs, and keep the verb as it is in its past participle form.
For example, we had a meeting with the company that designs the new amusement park of the city. In order to reduce the adjective clause in this sentence, we eliminate the connector, that, which is also the subject of the adjective clause, and add ing to the verb, design.
So, the new sentence becomes like this. We had a meeting with the company designing the new amusement park of the city.
Another example. I like the stories which are written by Mark Twain. In order to reduce the adjective clause in this sentence, we eliminate the connector, which is also the subject of the adjective clause, and the helping verb, are, and keep the verb as it's with no change.
So, the new sentence becomes like this. I like the stories written by Mark Twain.
Note that this adjective clause is in the passive mode.
The adjective clause, in its complete form, can come anywhere in the sentence after the noun it describes.
The adjective clause, in its reduced form, can precede the main clause. In this case, the adjective clause is describing the subject of the main clause.
The adverb clause is used to serve some useful purpose in the sentence in relation to the main clause, such as time connection, contrast, condition, contradiction, justification. It comes either after or before the main clause. The connectors of adverb clauses are named subordinating conjunctions. Time connection.
For example, I always fasten the seat belt when I drive. When I drive, here is the adverb clause, and it relates to the main clause in time. The connector of this adverb clause is when.
Another example. I listen to music while I study. While I study, here is the adverb clause, and it relates to the main clause in time. The connector of this adverb clause is while.
Contrast.
For example, I like detective movies, whereas my sister likes comedy ones. Whereas my sister likes comedy ones, here is the adverb clause. It acts as a contrast to the main clause. The connector of this adverb clause is whereas.
Condition.
For example, if I arrive in the city early, I will drop by. If I arrive in the city early, here is the adverb clause. It acts as a condition for the main clause to happen. The connector of this adverb clause is if.
Contradiction.
For example, although she was tutored in mathematics, she didn't soccer high. Although she was tutored in mathematics, here is the adverb clause. It acts as a contradiction to the main clause. The connector of this adverb clause is although.
Justification.
For example, I couldn't sleep well last night because I drank too much coffee. Because I drank too much coffee here is the adverb clause. It acts as a justification for the main clause. The connector of this adverb clause is because.
Connectors of adverb clauses.
Time connectors.
When, while, after, before, once, until, as, and whenever.
Cause connectors.
Because, as, for, and since.
Contrast connectors.
Whereas, while, and whilst.
Contradiction connectors.
Although, even though, in spite of the fact, while.
Condition connectors.
If, unless, in case.
Other connectors.
As long as, even if, even though, in order that, wherever, however.
How the adverb clauses are reduced. The adverb clauses are reduced the same way the adjective clauses are done, with slight difference.
When the verb of the adverb clause is in the active mode, we keep the connector, eliminate the subject, plus helping verbs, and add ing to the present form of the verb.
When the verb of the adverb clause is in the passive mode, we keep the connector, eliminate the subject, plus helping verbs, and keep the verb form as it is in its past participle form.
For example, because I had too much work to finish, I skipped the dinner with my family. In order to reduce the adverb clause in this sentence, we eliminate the connector, because, and the subject I, and change the verb's form to the present participle, the base form, plus ing.
So, the new sentence becomes like this: having too much work to finish, I skipped the dinner with my family.
Note, in the case of the connector, because, it must be eliminated, because it can't be followed by a noun or participle.
Another example. Although the machine was maintained not long ago, it broke down again. In order to reduce the adverb clause in this sentence, we keep the connector although, eliminate the subject, the machine, and the helping verb, was, and keep the verb in its past participle form.
So, the new sentence becomes like this: although maintained not long ago, the machine broke down again.
As a condition, to be able to reduce the adverb clause, the subjects of both the main clause and the adverb clause must be one agent for both clauses.
For example, while I was shopping, a beautiful dress caught my eye. The adverb clause in this sentence can't be reduced, because the subject of the adverb clause is different from the subject of the main clause. If we reduced it, for example, the sentence would be like this: while shopping, a beautiful dress caught my eye. This will mean that the beautiful dress is the one who was shopping, which is wrong.
When the main verb of the adverb clause is a form of verb to be, it's often removed. However, with certain connectors, like because, it's retained and changed to the present participle.
For example, because Cusco City is rich in historical places, it attracts millions of tourists yearly. The reduced form of this sentence is going to be like this. Being rich in historical places, Cusco City attracts millions of tourists yearly. Another example. If it is cloudy and windy, it is going to rain. The reduced form of this sentence is going to be like this. If cloudy and windy, it is going to rain.
Not all adverb clauses can be reduced. Of adverb clauses that can be reduced are the adverb clauses of time connection, contradiction, justification, and condition. The connectors of the adverb clauses are often kept for clarity of the relation between the adverb clause and main clause. However, in the case of time connectors, they are usually eliminated. In the case of eliminating the connector of time, if the action of the adverb clause happens before the action of the main clause, we must use the perfect participle, having plus the past participle.
Let's contrast these two reduced sentences to understand the point. The first sentence says, watching the movie, I slept. The second sentence says, having watched the movie, I slept. The first sentence implies that he or she slept while he or she was watching the movie. The second sentence implies that he or she slept after he or she finished watching the movie. Therefore, present participle in a sentence always indicates that the action of the adverb clause happens, or happened at the same time, or during the action of the main clause, whereas perfect participle always indicates that the action of the adverb clause happens, or happened before the action of the main clause.
The adverb clause can come after or before the main clause. When it comes before the main clause, a comma is used to separate the two clauses. However, in the case of condition, contradiction, and contrast adverb clause, there is always a comma to separate it from the main clause, whether it comes before or after the main clause. The noun clause functions as a noun. Therefore, it can act as a subject, an object of verb, preposition, participle, or infinitive, a complement of verb to be, adjective, or noun.
The noun clause as a subject. For example, that she can walk on her feet again is pleasant thing. That she can walk on her feet again is the noun clause. It acts here as a subject of the main clause. The connector of this noun clause is that.
The noun clause as an object of verb.
For example, today the teacher explained how we can separate chemical compounds. How we can separate chemical compounds is the noun clause. It acts here as an object of the main clause. The connector of this noun clause is how.
The noun clause as an object of preposition.
For example, my father rebuked my sister severely for what she did to my little brother. What she did to my little brother is the noun clause. It acts here as an object of the preposition for. The connector of this noun clause is what.
The noun clause as an object of gerund.
For example, the doctor advised me against eating whatever causes me allergy. Whatever causes me allergy is the noun clause. It acts here as an object of the gerund, eating. The connector of this noun clause is whatever.
The noun clause has an object of infinitive.
For example, I want to see what you've prepared for the feast. What you've prepared for the feast is the noun clause. It acts here as an object of the infinitive, to see. The connector of this noun clause is what.
The noun clause has a complement of verb to be.
For example, he wrote a good essay, but his weakness was that he didn't take much care over punctuation. That he didn't take much care over punctuation here is the noun clause. It acts as a complement of the verb was. The connector of this noun clause is that.
The noun clause has a complement of adjective.
For example, I am optimistic that he assigned me to investigate the accident. That he assigned me to investigate the accident here is the noun clause. It acts as a complement of the adjective optimistic. The connector of this noun clause is that.
The noun clause has a complement of noun.
For example, I have a suspicion that he is not telling the truth. That he is not telling the truth here is the noun clause. It acts as a complement of the noun suspicion. The connector of this noun clause is that.
Connectors of noun clauses.
That. If. Whether. WH words such as what, when, where, who, whom, which, how, wherever, whenever, whichever, whatever, and however.
Now, how the noun clauses are reduced. The noun clause can be reduced to one of two forms. Either infinitive or gerund. Reducing noun clauses to infinitives.
The noun clause can be reduced to infinitive if it has the form connector plus subject plus modal plus verb, which bears the meaning of an act to do after a point of time identified from the main clause in the past, present, or future. The modals that give such meaning are should, shall, will, would, could, and can.
Process of reducing noun clause.
Keep the connector if it's a WH word, including whether, and eliminate it if it's either that or if. Eliminate the subject and the modal. Add the word to before the verb of the clause.
For example, could you please tell me where I can find a grocery store in this neighborhood? In order to reduce the noun clause in this sentence to infinitive, we keep the connector where, eliminate the subject I, and the modal can, and add to before the verb.
So, the new sentence becomes like this. Could you please tell me where to find a grocery store in this neighborhood?
Another example. The teacher advised me that I should work harder on mathematics. In order to reduce the noun clause in this sentence to infinitive, we eliminate the connector that, eliminate the subject I, and the modal should, and add to before the verb.
So, the new sentence becomes like this. The teacher advised me to work harder on mathematics.
Another example. He asked his partner if she would go out with him. In order to reduce the noun clause in this sentence to infinitive, we eliminate the connector if, eliminate the subject she and the modal would, and add to before the verb.
So, the new sentence becomes like this. He asked his partner to go out with him.
Another example. He reminded me that I should take my medication on time. In order to reduce the noun clause in this sentence to infinitive, we eliminate the connector that, eliminate the subject I, and the modal should, and add to before the verb.
So, the new sentence becomes like this. He reminded me to take my medication on time.
As a condition, if the verb of the main clause takes an indirect object before the noun clause, the subject of the noun clause must be the same as the indirect object, not the subject of the main clause, in order to be able to reduce it to infinitive without changing the meaning.
For example, he told me that he should leave now. The noun clause in this sentence can't be reduced, because the subject of the noun clause is different from the indirect object of the main clause. If we reduced it, for example, this sentence would be like this. He told me to leave now. This will mean that he is ordering the recipient of speech to leave rather than informing him or her about his intention to leave, and this is a complete distortion of the meaning.
If the verb of the main clause doesn't take indirect object, then the subject of the noun clause must be the same as the subject of the main clause so as to be able to reduce it to infinitive without changing the meaning.
For example, the professor agreed that Anna should attend the meeting. The noun clause in this sentence can't be reduced, because the subject of the noun clause is different from the subject of the main clause. If we reduced it, for example, the sentence would be like this. The professor agreed to attend the meeting. This means that the professor agreed that he, himself, attends the meeting, not Anna. This shift of the reference of the action attending the meeting from Anna to the professor is a distortion of the meaning of the original sentence.
Not all verbs can take infinitives after them, so make sure that the verb of the main clause can take infinitive before reducing the noun clause.
For example, I understand that I should think before I do. The noun clause in this sentence can't be reduced, because the verb understand can't take infinitive after it. If we reduced it, for example, the sentence would be like this. I understand to think before I do, which is linguistically unacceptable.
There are cases when the noun clause doesn't have modal and can be reduced to infinitive. There are also cases when the noun clause talks about an act done in synchronicity or prior to a point of time in the past, present, or future, and can be reduced to infinitive.
For example, I hope that I return home soon. The noun clause in this sentence doesn't have modal and can be reduced to infinitive. The new sentence after reduction is, I hope to return home soon. Another example. I pretended that I didn't care about money. The noun clause in this sentence talks about an action, caring, that was done in the past in synchronicity with another action, pretending, and can be reduced to infinitive. The new sentence after reduction is, I pretended not to care about money.
The noun clause can also be reduced when it acts as a subject or a complement of noun or adjective.
For example, that I am among my family makes me very happy. The noun clause in this sentence acts as a subject for the verb make. The reduced form of this sentence is, to be among my family makes me very happy. For example, it's a pity that you won't be able to attend the party. The noun clause in this sentence acts as a complement of the noun, pity. The reduced form of this sentence is, it's a pity not to be able to attend the party. Another example. It's important that kids do their favorite activities. The noun clause in this sentence acts as a complement of the adjective, important. The reduced form of this sentence is, it's important for kids to do their favorite activities. Note in this sentence we didn't eliminate the subject, kids. Instead we added the preposition, for, before it because it's going to be mysterious who do the activities, if we don't do so.
The noun clause can be reduced to gerund mostly when it acts as an object of certain verbs that can be followed by either a gerund or a noun clause, such as
recall, appreciate, imagine, anticipate, suggest, recommend, acknowledge, deny, admit, and propose.
Process of reducing noun clause to gerund.
Eliminate the connector mostly that. Eliminate the subject if it's the same as the subject of the main clause, or replace it by its possessive pronoun if it's different from the subject of the main clause. Change the verb to its gerund form, the base form plus ing.
For example, I recall that I saw the same scene in a play of the 80s. In order to reduce the noun clause in this sentence to gerund, eliminate the connector that, eliminate the subject I, and add ing to the base form of the verb saw.
So, the new sentence becomes like this. I recall seeing the same scene in a play of the 80s.
Another example. I anticipate that the government will raise taxes this year. In order to reduce the noun clause in this sentence to gerund, eliminate the connector that, add the possession s to the subject, the government, delete the modal verb will, and change the verb raise to the gerund form.
So, the new sentence becomes like this. I anticipate the government's raising taxes this year.
Another example. I recommend that you don't tell her. In order to reduce the noun clause in this sentence to gerund, eliminate the connector that, eliminate the subject, you, eliminate the helping verb, do, and change the verb tell to the gerund form.
So, the new sentence becomes like this. I recommend not telling her.
Note, in the case of the verb recommend and some other verbs like suggest and propose, we delete the subject of the noun clause, even though it's different from the subject of the main clause, because it's understood implicitly at whom the speech is aimed.
If this video was beneficial to you, please like, comment, and subscribe if interested to receive more material.